Chapter 7 Lady Eve. During vacation, I paid a visit to the house in which Max Demian had lived with his mother years before. An old lady was walking in the garden. I spoke to her and learned that the house was hers. I asked about the Demian family. She remembered them well, but she didn't know where they were living at the time. Since she noticed my interest, she invited me into the house, where she found a leather bound album and showed me a photo of Damien's mother. I could scarcely remember her anymore, but when I looked at the little portrait, my heart stood still. It was my dream image. There was it, the tall, almost masculine female figure resembling her son, with traces of motherhood, traces of severity, traces of deep passion, beautiful and alluring, beautiful and unapproachable, demon and mother, chastity and beloved. It was she. A wild feeling of the miraculous ran through me when I learned in that way that my dream image had lived and existed on earth. There really was a woman who looked like that, who bore the features of my destiny. Where was she? Where? And she was Damien's mother? Shortly thereafter, I set out on my trip, a strange trip. I rode unceasingly from place to place, pursuing each and every new idea, constantly searching for that woman. There were days when every figure I saw reminded me of her, hinted at her, resembled her, lured me through streets of unfamiliar cities, through railroad stations, onto trains, as if in complicated dreams. There were other days when I realized how futile my search was. Then I would sit idly somewhere in a park, in a hotel garden, in a waiting room, looking inside myself and trying to vivify the image within me. But it had now been scared off and was hard to capture. I was never able to sleep. It was only on train rides through unknown landscapes that I would doze off for 15 minutes at a time. Once in Zurich, a woman set her sights on me, a pretty, somewhat shameless female. I barely noticed her and walked by as if she didn't exist. I would sooner have died on the spot than have taken up with another woman for even an hour. I felt that my destiny was drawing me onward. I felt that fulfillment was near, and I was crazy with impatience at not being able to do anything about it. Once at a railroad station, I think it was in Innsbruck, I saw at the window of a train just pulling out a figure that reminded me of her, and I was miserable for days. And suddenly the figure appeared to me again in a dream at night. I woke up with the embarrassed, empty feeling of the futility of my chase, and I took the next train back home. A few weeks later, I enrolled in the University of H. Everything disappointed me. The lecture course on the history of philosophy that I attended was just as spiritless and mechanical as the activities of the young students. Everything was so routine, everyone behaved like everyone else, and the flush of merriment on their boys' faces looked so depressingly viscous and ready made. But I was free. My whole day was at my disposal. I lived in a quiet, pretty place nestled in the old walls outside of town, and I had a few volumes of Nietzsche on my table. I lived with him, feeling the solitude of his soul and sensing the faith that drove him on implacably. I suffered along with him and was overjoyed to know that there had been a man who had followed his path so relentlessly. Late one evening, I was sauntering through town in the blowing autumn wind and I heard the student glee clubs singing in the taverns. Through the open window, clouds of tobacco smoke drifted out, and in a chance outpouring, the singing, loud and firm, but uninspired and lifelessly uniform. I stood at a street corner listening. From two taverns, the ritually performed jollity of youth emerged into the night. Everywhere a sense of community, everywhere a squatting together, everywhere a suffering of destiny and an escape into the warm togetherness of the herd. Behind me, two men were walking by slowly. I heard a fragment of their conversation. Isn't it exactly like the bachelor's lodge in a primitive village? One of them said. Everything is the same. Even tattoos are still in fashion. You see, this is young Europe. The voice sounded oddly admonitory to me, familiar. I followed those two dark streets down. One was a Japanese, small and well dressed. When he stood under a street lamp, I saw his smiling yellow face gleaming. Then the other one spoke again. Well, it's probably no better with you in Japan. People who don't run after the herd are rare everywhere. Even here, there are a few. Each word penetrated me with joyful alarm. I knew the speaker. It was Demian. Through the windly night, I followed him and the Japanese down the dark streets, listening to their conversations and enjoying the sound of Demian's voice. It had its old timbre, it had its own fine certainty and calm. It had still had power over me. Everything was all right now. I had found him. At the end of a suburban street, the Japanese said good night and unlocked a house door. Simeon started back the way he had come. I had halted and was awaiting him in the middle of the street, my heart pounding. I saw him come toward me, erect and with a springy step, wearing a brown slicker, a thin walking stick hooked over one arm. Without modifying his even pace, he came right up to me, took off his hat, and showed me the same old bright face with the determined mouth and the peculiar brightness on his broad forehead. Demian, I exclaimed. He held out his hand to me. So there you are, Sinclair. I have been waiting for you. Did you know I was here? I didn't exactly know, but I was hoping for it firmly. I didn't see you until this evening, in fact. You were following us the whole time. Then you recognized me right off. Naturally, to be sure, you have changed, but you have the mark, don't you? The mark? What kind of mark? We used to call it the mark of Cain. If you can still recall, it's our mark. You have always had it. That's why I became your friend, but now it's become more distinct. I didn't know. Or actually, I did. Once I painted a picture of you, Timian, and I was amazed to find that it looked like me too. What was that mark? It was. I'm so glad you are back. My mother will be happy too. I got frightened. Your mother? Is she here? But she doesn't know me. Oh, she knows about you. She will recognize you even if you don't tell her who you are. It's been a long time since you sent any news about yourself. Oh, I often wanted to write, but I couldn't. For some time, I have felt that I would surely find you again soon. I have been waiting for it every day. He linked arms with me and we walked on together. Calm radiated from him and permeated me. Soon, we were chatting just as in the past. We recalled our school days, our confirmation lessons, and even that unfortunate meeting during vacation. The only thing we didn't discuss even now was the earliest and the strongest bond between us. That business with Franz Cromer. Unexpectedly, we were in the midst of strange, premonitory conversations. Following up that talk between Demian and the Japanese, we had spoken about student life and from there had gone on to other topics that seemed very remote. But as Demian spoke, it all came together in a tight connection. He spoke about the European spirit and the keynote of the era. Everywhere, he said, togetherness and the herd instincts were prevalent, but freedom and love were nowhere to be found. All this sense of community, from student societies and glee clubs all the way up to national states, was a compulsive form. It was a community based on anxiety, on fear, on confusion, and was inwardly rotten, old, and close to collapse. Community, Chimian said, is a fine thing, but the type we see blossoming all over isn't true community. It will originate anew out of the knowledge that individuals have of one another, and for a while it will transform the world. The kind of community we have now is merely herd instinct. People run to one another for shelter because they are afraid of one another. Capitalists stick together, workers stick together, scholars stick together. And why are they afraid? A person is afraid only when he isn't at one with himself. They are afraid because they have never accepted themselves. A community consisting exclusively of people afraid of the unknown in themselves. They all feel that the rules they live by are no longer valid, that they are following outdated commandments. Neither their religions nor their morality, nothing is suited to what we need. For a century and more, Europe has done nothing but study and build factories. They know exactly how many grams of powder it takes to kill someone, but they don't know how to pray to God. They don't even know how to be contented for an hour at a time. Just take a look at a student's tavern like these, or even a pleasure resort that rich people go to. Hopeless. My dear Sinclair, no serenity can come from any of that. These people who rub elbows so anxiously are filled with fear and filled with malice. None of them trusts anyone else. They cling to ideals that no longer count, and they cast stones at everyone who proclaims a new one. I foresee confrontations. They will come, believe me, they will come soon. Naturally, they won't improve the world. Whether the workers kill the factory owners or Russia and Germany shoot at each other, that will only mean a change of ownership, but it won't be all for nothing. It will show clearly just how worthless today's ideals are. There will be a cleaning out of Stone Age gods. This world, as it now is, wants to die, it wants to perish, and it will. And what will become of us then? I asked. Us? Oh, maybe we will perish too. Even people are like us can be killed. But that won't eliminate us. The will of the future will gather around, and whatever we may leave behind, or around those of us who survive. The will of mankind will show itself, that will which for some time our Europe has drowned out of with its fairground spile about technology and science. And then it will be seen that the will of mankind is never the same as that of our current communities. The states and the nations, the organizations and the churches. Rather, nature's intentions for man are inscribed in individuals, in you and me. They were inscribed in Jesus and in Nietzsche. There will be room for these currents, the only important ones, and naturally they may take on a different aspect daily. When the communities of today collapse, late at night we halted in front of a garden by a river. This is where we live, said Demian. Come see us soon. We are expecting you eagerly. Happily, I made my long way home through the night, which had grown chilly. Here and there, homebound students were noisily staggering through the town. I had often observed the contrast between their funny style of merriment and my own solitary life, often with a feeling I was missing something, often sarcastically, but never yet had I felt as I now did, calmly and with secret strength, how little that concerned me, how distant and bygone that world was to me. I recalled officials in my hometown, elderly, dignified gentlemen who clung to the memories of the college years they had boozed away as if they were souvenirs of a blissful paradise, and who celebrated the same sort of culture of the vanished freedom of their student days that poets or other romantics devote to their childhood. It's the same all over. All people were seeking freedom and happiness somewhere behind themselves, out of the sheer fear of being reminded of their own responsibilities and being admonished at to travel their own path. For a couple of years they drank and raised hell, and then they knuckled under the same and become senior citizens in the civil service. Yes, things were rotten, rotten among us. And this stupidity of student life was less stupid and harmful than 100 other kinds. Yet, when I arrived at my distant lodgings and went to bed, all those thoughts had scattered, and my mind was completely and expectantly occupied by the great promise which that day had made me. As soon as I wished, even the very next day, I was to meet Demian's mother. Let the students frequent their taverns and tattoo their faces. Let the world be rotten and await its destruction. What was that to me? I was waiting solely for my destiny to come face to face with me in a new guise. I slept soundly till late morning. The next day dawned for me as a solemn holiday, such as I hadn't experienced since the Christmas holidays of my childhood. I was filled with the deepest unrest, but without any fear. I felt that an important day had dawned for me. I saw and sensed the world around me was transformed, expectant, full of personal significance. And Solomon, even the gently falling autumn rain was beautiful, silent, and full of earnestly joyous holiday music. For the first time, the outside world harmonized perfectly with my inner world. Such occasions are a holiday for the soul, and life is worth living. No house, no shop window, no face in the street disturbed me. Everything was as it had to be, but it wasn't wearing the empty face of the everyday and familiar. Rather, it was expectant nature. It was reverently ready for destiny. That's how I had seen the world on the mornings of a major holiday, Christmas and Easter, when I was a little boy. I hadn't known this world could still be so beautiful. I had grown accustomed to live inwardly, and I was resigned to the belief that I had simply lost all feelings for the world outside. to the belief that the loss of those glowing colors was inevitably linked to the loss of childhood, and that to some extent the freedom and adulthood of the soul had to be paid for with the renunciation of that lovely shining. Now I saw delightedly that all of that had merely been covered over and thrown in the shade, and that it was possible ever for a liberated person giving up childish joys to see the world in its radiance and to taste the intimate thrills of a child's view. The hour came when I rediscovered that suburban garden beside which I had taken leave of Max Demian the night before. Concealed behind tall trees that were grey in the rain stood a small house, bright and cozy, tall flowering plants behind a big glass wall, dark room walls with pictures and bookshelves behind gleaming windows. The entrance door led directly into a little, heated vestibule. A silent, elderly maid, dark complexioned, with a white apron, invited me in and took my coat. She left me alone in the vestibule. I looked around, and at once I was in the midst of my dream. Upon the dark wooden wall over a door hung a well known picture under glass in a dark frame. My bird with the golden yellow sparrowhawk's head breaking its way out of the globe. I stood still, deeply moved. My heart was so happy and melancholy at the same time, as if at that moment everything I ever did or lived through was coming back to me in the form of a response and a fulfillment. Quick as a flash, I saw a throng of images racing past my soul. My father's house in my hometown with the old stone coat of arms at the top of its entrance archway. Demian as a boy drawing the coat of arms. Myself as a boy fearfully ensnared in my friend Cromer's evil spell. Myself as an adolescent painting the bird of my desire at the quiet table in my little student's room. My soul entangled in the web formed by its own thread, and everything down to that moment, recalled in my mind, while I affirmed it, responded to it, approved it. With eyes that had become moist, I gazed at my picture and read within myself. Then I looked down. Below the picture of the word, in the now open doorway, stood a tall woman in a dark dress. It was she. I was unable to say a word. Her face timeless and ageless like her son's, and similarly filled with enthusiastic willpower, the beautiful, venerable lady was smiling at me amiably. Her gaze spelled fulfillment. Her welcome signified homecoming. In silence, I held out my hands to her. She grasped both of my hands with her own firm, warm hands. "You are Sinclair. I recognized you at once. Welcome." Her voice was deep and warm. I drank it in like a sweet wine. And now I looked up at her tranquil face, at her dark, unfathomable eyes, at her vivacious, mature lips, at her open, princely forehead, which bore the mark. "How happy I am," I told her, kissing her hands. "I think that all my life I have always been on a journey, and now I have around home." She gave me a maternal smile. "No one ever arrives home," she said amiably, "but when the paths of friends meet, the whole world looks like a home for a while." She expressed what I had felt on my way to meet her. Her voice and even her words were very similar to her son's, and yet quite different. It was all more mature, warmer. more self evident. But just as Max years ago had never given anyone the impression that he was a young boy, in the same way his mother didn't look like the mother of a grown son. The aura of her face and her hair was so young and sweet, her golden skin so taut and unwrinkled, her mouth so rosy. She stood before me looking even more regal than in my dream, and her proximity was love's happiness, her gaze was fulfillment. And so this was the new guise in which my destiny revealed itself to me. No longer sovereign, no longer making me lonely, no ripe and pleasure laden. I made no decisions. I took no vow. I had arrived at a goal, at an elevated stopping place on my journey, from which the continuation of the path was revealed in its length and splendor, striving toward promised hands, shaded by treetops of my nearby happiness, cooled by the nearby gardens of all sorts of pleasure. Let things go with me as they might. I was blissful just knowing that this woman existed, just drinking in her voice and inhaling her presence. Let her become my mother, my beloved, my goddess. As long as she was there, as long as my path was close to hers. She pointed up at my picture of the sparrow hawk. You never gave our Max greater pleasure than with this picture, she said reflectively, and to me too. We have waited for you, and when the picture came, we knew you were on the way to us. When you were a little boy, Sinclair, one day my son came home from school and said, there's a boy who has the mark on his forehead. He's got to become my friend. That was you. You didn't have an easy time of it, but we trusted in you. Once, when you were home on vacation, you met Max again. At the time you were about 16. Max told me about it. I interrupted her. Oh, I'm sorry he told you that. I was then going through my most miserable phase. Yes, Max said to me. Now Sinclair has the hardest time ahead of him. He's trying once more to escape into society. He's even become a tavern goer. But he won't succeed. His mark is hidden, but it burns him in secret. Wasn't that so? Oh, yes, it was so. Precisely so. Then I found Beatrice, and then finally another guide came my way. His name was Pistorius. Only then did it become clear to me why my boyhood was so closely linked to Max, why I couldn't break away from him. Dear lady, dear mother, I often thought at the time that I had have to kill myself. Is everyone's path that difficult? She stroked my hair with a hand that was light as air. It's always difficult to be born. As you know, the bird must make an effort to break out of the egg. Think back and ask, was the path really that difficult? Merely difficult? Wasn't it also beautiful? Could you have thought of a more beautiful or easier one? I shook my head. It was difficult, I said, as if asleep. It was difficult until the dream came. She nodded and looked at me penetratingly. Yes, one must find one's dream. Then the path becomes easy. But no dream lasts forever. Each one is replaced by a new one, and you shouldn't try to hold on to any of them. I was severely frightened. Was that already a warning? Was that already a rejection? But I didn't care. I was ready to let myself be guided by her without asking what the goal was. But I don't know how long my dream will last, I said. I wish it were eternal. Below the picture of the world, my destiny has welcomed me, like a mother and like a beloved. I belong to my destiny and to no one else. As long as the dream is your destiny, you must remain faithful to it, she said, in earnest confirmation of my words.
A sadness seized on me, and the ardent desire to die at that enchanted hour. I felt tears. How infinitely long it had been since I last wept, welling up in my eyes uncontrollably and overpowering me. I turned away from her violently, walked over to the window, and looked out over the flower pots with unseeing eyes. Behind me, I heard her voice. It sounded calm, and yet it was as full of tenderness as a goblet filled to the brim with wine. Sinclair, you are a child. You know your destiny loves you. One day it will be all yours, just as in your dreams, if you remain faithful. I had regained control of myself, and I turned my face to her again. She gave me her hands. I have a few friends, she said with a smile. A few very rare, few very close friends who call me Lady Eve. You may call me that too, if you like. She led me to the door, opened it, and indicated the garden. You will find Max out there. Beneath the tall trees, I stood numb and shaken, more awake or deeper in dreams than ever. I didn't know which. Quietly, the rain was dripping from the boughs. I walked slowly into the garden, which extended far along the river bank. Finally, I found Demian. He was standing in a little open garden building, stripped to the waist, practicing boxing with a sand-filled bag that was suspended there. I halted in amazement. Demian looked marvelous, with a broad chest and a firm, manly head. His raised arms, with their taut muscles, were strong and capable. His movements sprang like playing fountains from his hips, upper back, and upper joint. Demian, I called. What are you doing there? He laughed merrily. I'm practicing. I promised the little Japanese a wrestling match. The guy is as nimble as a cat and naturally just as shy. But he won't beat me. It's a kind of humbling that I owe him in a very small way. He pulled on his shirt and jacket. You have already met my mother, he asked. Yes, Jimmy, what a splendid mother you have, Lady Eve. The name suits her perfectly. She's like the mother of all beings. He looked into my face reflectively for a moment. You already know that name? You have a right to be proud, young man. You are the first person she's ever told it to the right from the outset. From that day on, I frequented their house like a son and brother, but also like a lover. When I closed the gate behind me, yes, as soon as I saw the tall trees in the garden looming up in the distance, I felt rich and happy. Outside, reality existed. Outside, there were streets and houses, people in their institutions, libraries, and lecture halls. But in here, there was love, soul. Here, fairy tale and dream dwelt. And yet, our life was by no means cut off from the world. In our thoughts and conversations, we often lived right in the midst of it. But on another place, we were separated from the majority of people, not by frontiers, but merely by different ways of seeing. Our task was to represent an island in the world, perhaps a model to be followed, but at any rate to make our life the annunciation of a different possibility. I, who had been solitary for so long, became acquainted with the society that is possible among people who have experienced total isolation. Never again did I desire to return to the banquets of the fortunate, the feasts of the happy. Never again was I assailed by envy or homesickness when I observed the societies of others. And slowly I was initiated into the mystery of those who bore the mark on their person. We who bore the mark might well be considered by the rest of the world as strange, even as insane and dangerous. We had awoken or were awaking, and we were striving for an ever more perfect state of wakefulness, whereas the ambition and quest for happiness of the others consisted of linking their opinions, ideals, duties, their life and happiness even more closely with those of the herd. They too strove, they too showed signs of strength and greatness. But as we saw it, whereas we marked man represented nature's determination to create something new, individual and forward looking, the others lived in the determination to stay the same. For them, mankind, which they loved as much as we did, was a fully formed entity that had to be preserved and protected. For us, mankind was a distant future toward which we were all journeying, whose aspects no one knew, whose laws weren't written down anywhere. Beside Lady Eve, Max, and me, our circle included many other questers of very different kinds, some closer to us, some more distant. Many of them traveled special paths, had set unusual goals for themselves, and were adherents of special opinions and duties. Among them were astrologers and Kabbalists, even a follower of Count Tolstoy, and all sorts of gentle, shy, vulnerable people, followers of new sects, practitioners of Hindu yoga, vegetarians, and others. Actually, we had nothing in common intellectually with all these people except the respect each of them accorded to the secret life stream of the others. Others were closer to us, those who pursued mankind's quest for gods and new ideals in the past, and whose studies often reminded me of those of Pistorius. They brought along books, translated texts in Asian languages for us, showed us illustrations of old symbols and rites, and taught us to see that mankind's entire treasury of ideas up to now has consisted of the dreams of the unconscious soul, dreams in which mankind has gropingly followed the premonitions of its cultural possibilities. And so we ranged through the ancient world's marvelous thousand-headed cluster of gods all the way to the crowning of the great change represented by Christianity. We became familiar with the creeds of pies and choriats and the changes in religions from one nation to another, and from all we collected we derived a critique of our own age and present day Europe, which through our mighty efforts had created powerful new weapons for mankind, but had finally fallen into a deep and at last blatant spiritual desolation, for it had caked the whole world while losing its soul in the process. Here too there were believers and confessors of well defined hopes and doctrines of salvation. There were Buddhists who wanted to convert Europe and disciplines of Tolstoy and other creeds. We in the narrower circle listened but accepted none of these doctrines as anything but symbols. We marked men were not at all worried about the shape of the future would take. To us, every credo, every doctrine of salvation seemed stillborn and useless, and there was only one thing we conceived as our duty and destiny for each of us to become so completely himself, so completely in harmony with the created germ of nature within himself, living in accordance with its command, that the uncertain future would find us ready for any eventuality, whatever it may bring. For this, whether spoken or unspoken, was clear in all our minds that a rebirth and the collapse of what now existed was near and already perceptible. Demian said to me at times, "What will come is beyond imagining. The soul of Europe is an animal that has lain in fetters for an infinitely long time. When it is fed, its first impulses won't be of the most charming time. but its path and byways don't matter as long as the true distress of its soul is revealed. That distress which for so long has again and again falsely denied and anesthetized. That will be our day. Then we will be needed, not as guides or new legislators. We won't live to see the new laws, but as willing people, people ready to go along and take a stand where destiny calls them. Look, all people are ready to accomplish unbelievable things when their ideals are threatened, but no one's there when a new ideal, a new, possibly dangerous and unfamiliar string of growth knocks at the door. We will be those few who are there and go along. That's what we are marked for. As Cain was marked to arouse fear and hatred, and to drive the people of those days out of their idyllic narrow confines into perilous distances. All the people who have affected the course of mankind, all of them without exception, were only capable and influential because they were prepared for their destiny. That goes for Moses and Buddha. It goes for Napoleon and Bismarck. Whichever movement a person serves, whichever pole governs his action, is not for him to choose. If Bismarck had understood the Social Democrats and had adapted his policies to them, he would have been a smart man, but not a man of destiny. And so it was with Napoleon, with Caesar, with Loyola, with all of them, that must always be conceived of it in the biological and evolutionary sense. When the enormous changes on the Earth's surface from aquatic animals onto land and terrestrial animals into the water, it was the individuals ready for their destiny that were able to accomplish new, unheard of things and to save their species by means of new adaptations. Whether the rescuers were the individuals that had earlier been outstanding in their species as conservatives and preservers of old ways, or whether the eccentrics and revolutionaries saved the species, we don't know. They were ready and thus able to preserve the life of the species for the necessary new developments. That we do know. Therefore, we want to be ready. Lady Eve was often present during such discussions, but she herself did not speak in that fashion. For each of us who uttered his thoughts, she was a listener and echo, full of trust, full of comprehension. It was as if all her thoughts originated in her and returned to her. To sit near her, to hear her voice occasionally, and to share in the atmosphere of soulful maturity that surrounded her was happiness to me. She immediately sensed any change, dullness of spirit, a renewal that might be taking place in me. I felt as if my dreams at night were inspirations coming from her. I often recounted them to her, and she found them comprehensible and natural. There was no peculiar feature that she couldn't follow with clear discernment. For a time, I had dreams that were like reconstructions of the conversation we had during the day. I dreamed that the whole world was in an uproar and that I, either alone or with Demian, was waiting in suspense for the great destiny. The destiny remained hidden, but somehow it bore the features of Lady Eve. To be chosen or rejected by her, that was destiny. Sometimes she said with a smile, your dream isn't complete, Cynthia. You have forgotten the best part. And then at times I remembered the rest and couldn't understand how I could have forgotten it. Occasionally I became dissatisfied and tortured by desires. I thought I could no longer abide to see her next to me without taking her in my arms. That too she would notice at once. When I once stayed away for several days and returned all upset, she took me aside and said, you shouldn't surrender yourself to wishes you don't believe in. I know what you desire. You must be able to give up those wishes or else desire them completely or firmly. If someday you are able to make the request feeling quite certain it will be granted, and then it will actually be granted, but you make wishes and then regret them, feeling afraid all the while. But you have to get over that. I will tell you a tale. And she told me about a young man who was in love with a star. He stood by the sea, held out his hands, and worshipped the star. He dreamt about it and turned his thoughts to it, but he knew, or thought he knew, that a star couldn't be embraced by a human being. He deemed it his fate to a love a heavenly body with no hope of being required. And on the basis of that notion, he constructed an entire poetics of the life consisting of renunciation and silent, faithful suffering, which was to improve him and purify him. But all his dreams were of the star. Once he was standing by the sea again at night on the high cliff, looking at the star and blazing with love for it, and in a moment of supreme longing he jumped and plunged into the void in direction of the star. But at the moment he jumped, he still thought, quick as a flash, but it's impossible. There he lay, down on the beach, shattered. He didn't know how to love. If at the moment he jumped, he had had the psychic strength to believe firmly and certainly that his love would be required, he would have flown into the sky to be reunited with the star. Love ought not to make requests, she said, but shouldn't make demands either. Love must have the strength to reach certainty for itself. Then it no longer undergoes the power of attraction but exerts it. Sinclair, your love is being attracted by me. Whenever it begins to attract me, I shall come. I don't want to make a gift of myself, I want to be won. But another time she told me another tale. It was about a man who loved without hope. He withdrew completely inside himself and thought he would burn up with love. He lost contact with the world. He no longer saw the blue sky and the green forest. The brook didn't murmur for him. The harp didn't sound for him. Everything had gone under and he had become poor and miserable. But his love grew, and he was much readier to die and wither away than to renounce the possession of the beautiful woman he loved. Then he noticed that his love had burned up everything else in him. It became powerful and exerted more and more attraction, and the beautiful woman was compelled to follow. She came. He stood there with outstretched arms to draw her to himself, but when she stood before him, she was totally transformed, and with trembling he felt and saw that he had attracted to himself the entire world he had lost. It stood before him and yielded itself to him. Sky and forest and brook, everything came to meet him in new colors, vivid and splendid. It belonged to him, it spoke his language, and instead of merely winning a woman, he had the whole world on his bosom, and every star in the sky shone within him and sparkled joy into his soul. He had loved, and by doing so had found himself, but most people love in order to lose themselves. My love for Lady Eve seemed like the only thing my life contained, but every day it took on a different aspect. Sometimes I was sure I felt that it wasn't her physical person that my whole being was drawn to and strove to win, but that she was only a symbol of my inner self and she was trying merely to lead me deeper into myself. Often I heard her say things that sounded like answers given by my unconscious to burning questions that were agitating me. Then again, there were moments when I was aflame with sensuous desire in her presence and I kissed objects she had touched, and gradually the sensuous and the nonsensious love, the reality and the symbol, began to overlap. At such times, I would think of her back in my room in calm lovingness, while I thought I could feel her hand in mine and her lips on mine. Or else I was with her, looking at her face, talking with her, and hearing her voice, and yet unsure whether she was real and not a dream. I begin to sense how someone can possess a permanent, immortal love. By reading a book, I gained a new insight. It was the same feeling as being kissed by Lady Eve. She stroked my hair, and a mature, fragrant warmth emanated from her smile, and I had the same feeling as if I had made some spiritual progress. Everything important and faithful for me was capable of assuming her form. She could transform herself into each of my thoughts, and each of them could be transformed into her. I had been dreading Christmas vacation when I would be with my parents because I thought it would surely be torture to be away from Lady Eve for 2 weeks. But it was no torture. It was wonderful to be home and to think about her. When was back in H dash, I stayed away from her house for 2 more days in order to enjoy the sense of security and freedom from dependence on her physical presence. I also had dreams in which my union with her took place in new, metaphorical ways. She was an ocean and I a river flowing into it. She was a star and I another star journeying toward her. We met and felt each other's attraction, stayed together, and revolved around each other blissfully for all eternity in close musical orbits. I told her that dream the first time I visited her again. It's a beautiful dream, she said quietly. Make it come true. There came a day in early spring that I had never forgotten. I stepped into the vestibule, a window was open, and a gentle breeze wafted the heavy scent of my hyacinth through the room. Since there no one was to be seen, I went upstairs to Max Demian's study. I knocked softly at the door and went in without waiting for a response, just as I had become accustomed to do so. The room was dark, all the curtains were drawn, the door to a little side room where Max had installed a chemistry lab was open. From there came the bright white light of the springtime sun that was shining through rain clouds. I thought no one was there and I drew back one of the traps. Then I saw Max Chimian sitting on a stool close to the curtained window. He was hunched up and strangely altered, and in a flash the thought ran through me, you have experienced this before. His arms were hanging motionless, his hands were in his lap, his face was leaning a little forward, his open eyes were unseeing and lifeless, and his rigid pupils reflected a small spot of harsh light. As a piece of glass would, his pallid face was sunken in and had no expression except that of a horrible immobility. It looked like an age old animal masked on the portal of a temple. He didn't seem to be breathing. I felt a thrill of recollection. I had once seen him looking exactly like that, year before, even when I was a still young boy. That's how his eyes had stared inwardly. That's how his hand had laid together lifelessly. A fly had crawled over his face, and at that time, some 6 years before, he had looked just as old and timeless. Not a wrinkle in his face was different today. Assailed by fear, I stepped softly out of the room and walked downstairs. In the vestibule, I met Lady Eve. She was pale and seemed weary. In a way I didn't associate with her, a shadow passed through the window. The harsh white sunlight had suddenly disappeared. I was with Max. I whispered rapidly. Has anything happened? He's asleep or meditating. I don't know which. I saw him this way once before. I hope you didn't awaken him, she said quickly. No, he didn't hear me. I went right out again. Lady Eve, tell me what's wrong with him. She drew the back of her hand across her forehead. Be calm, Sinclair. Nothing's happening to him. He has withdrawn. It won't last long. She stood up and went out into the garden, even though it was just starting to rain. I was aware that she didn't want me to accompany her, and so I paced to and fro in the vestibule, smelling the numbingly fragrant thing, gazing at my painted world over the door, and breathing in anxiously the strange shade that filled the house that morning. What was it? What had happened? Lady Eve soon returned. Raindrops hung in her dark hair. She sat down in her armchair. Weariness was upon her. I stepped up to her, leaned over her, and kissed away the drops from her hair. Her eyes were bright and calm, but the drops tasted like tears. Should I see how he is? I asked in a whisper. She smiled faintly. Don't be a child, Cynthia. She admonished me loudly, as if she wanted to break a spell she herself was under. Leave now and come back later. I can't talk with you now. I left and escaped from house and town in the direction of the hills. The thin rain fell on me obliquely. The clouds succeeded by as if in fear, low in the sky, under heavy pressure. Down below there was hardly any wind, but up in the hills a storm seemed to be raging. Several times the pale, harsh sunlight momentarily broke through the steel grey of the clouds. Then a fluffy yellow cloud came drifting across the sky. It condensed against that grey wall, and in a few seconds the wind formed an image out of the yellow and blue, a gigantic bird that tore itself out of the blue chaos and with broad wing beats disappeared into the sky. Then the storm became audible, and the rain mixed with hail rattled down. A brief clap of thunder with a frightening and improbably loud noise crashed over the rain-laced countryside. Immediately thereafter, a glimpse of sun broke through, and on the nearby mountains pale snow gleamed in unreal pallor above the brown woods. When I returned hours later, wet and wind blown, Demian himself opened the door to the house. He brought me up to his room. In the lab, a glass flame was burning. Papers were scattered around. He seemed to have been working. Sit down, he said invitingly. You must be tired. It was a terrible storm, and I can see you were out there in the midst of it. Tea is on the way. Something is happening today. I began hesitantly. It can't be only this little storm. He looked at me inquiringly. Have you seen anything? Yes, for a moment I saw an image distinctly in the cloud. What sort of image? It was a bird. The sparrowhawk, was it that? Your dream bird? Yes, it was my sparrowhawk. It was yellow and gigantic, and it flew into the dark blue sky. Demian heaved a deep sigh. There was a no. The elderly maid was bringing tea. Take some, Cynthia, please. I believe you didn't see the bird merely by chance. By chance? Do people see things like that by chance? You are right, they don't. It means something. Do you know what? No, I only feel that it means some catastrophe, a step forward in our destiny. I believe it concerns us all. He was backing and forth excitedly. A step forward in our destiny? He shouted. I had the same kind of dream last night, and yesterday my mother had a premonition that meant the same thing. I dreamt I was climbing a ladder that was leaning up against a tree trunk or a tower. When I reached the top, saw the whole countryside. It was a wide plain on fire with all its towns and villages. I can't tell you all of it yet. Not everything is clear to me yet. Do you interpret the dream as applying to you? I asked. To me, of course. Nobody dreams of things that doesn't concern him, but it doesn't concern me alone. You are right about that. I can make a fairly accurate distinction between dreams that indicate stirrings in my own soul and those very rare ones that point to the destiny of mankind as a whole. I have seldom had such dreams, and never one of which I could say it was a prophecy and came true. Interpretations are too uncertain, but this I know for a fact. I have had a dream that doesn't concern me alone. You see, this dream is connected with others that I have had in the past, and it's a continuation of them. It's from these dreams, Cynthia, that I derive the premonitions I have already spoken to you about. We know that the world we live in is thoroughly decayed, but that's not a sufficient reason to prophesy its destruction or something like that. But for several years, I have had dreams from which I could conclude or feel, or what have you, let's say, I feel that the collapse of an old world is moving closer. At first, the premonitions were very weak and remote, but they have become more and more distinct and strong. So far, all I know is that something big and terrible is impending. Something that concerns me and everybody. Sinclair, we are going to live through the thing we have often discussed. The world wants to renew itself. There's a smell of death in the air. No new thing can arrive unless an old thing dies. It's more terrible than I had imagined. I gazed at him in fear. Can't you tell me the rest of your dream? I requested timidly. He shook his head. No. The door opened and Lady Eve came in. There you are sitting together. Children, aren't you sad? Are you? She looked lively and no longer tired. Demian smiled at her and she came over to us as a mother comes to frightened children. We are not sad, mother. We are just been puzzling over these new signs a little. But it doesn't matter. Whatever is coming will suddenly be here, and then we will learn soon enough what we need to know. But I was in a bad mood, and when I took my leave and was walking through the vestibule alone, I felt that the fragrance of the hyacinths was weak, stale, and corpse like. A shadow had fallen over us.